with any product, there's only two things you need to do to be successful. You need to get the product on the shelf, and you need to get the consumer to take the product off the shelf. If you can do those two things really well, you've got success.
You're listening to CPG Launch Leaders, the show where we interview new product trailblazers. Get ready for inspiration and secrets from the front lines of CPG innovation. Now here are our hosts, Darcy Ramler and Alan Peretz.
Welcome to CPG Launch Leaders. I'm Alan Peretz, and I'm here with my co-host, Darcy Ramler. Today, we have a really special episode. Susan Levy has joined us. Susan's the preeminent expert on RX to OTC switches in the industry. That's when a prescription drug gets approved to be sold over the counter.
Susan will explain the often long and complicated process to move from behind the pharmacy counter to the retail shelf. She is going to dive into how digital commerce has transformed the OTC shopper behavior. Let's get this thing started. Susan, we're beyond excited to have you today to share your stories about your work that you've done launching some iconic RX products into the OTC space. Before we dive in, we like to start every episode with one question. Currently, what new products have caught your attention in the market?
Thank you so much for having me on today, Darcy. I really appreciate it and would love to answer that question. The reality is that we don't have so many products that go from RX to OTC. And sometimes they are not all that novel. So this year, I think we're going to see some exciting launches. And I think we're going to be talking about them a little bit later, Narcan and potentially the first oral contraceptive. But when I look at the last few years, I think the one that catches my attention the most is Voltaren. That was an RX to OTC switch that was approved in February of 2020, so right before the pandemic lockdown. It was a GSK, of course, now Haleon product. And they did a great job of building awareness even prior to launch, despite what was going on with the pandemic. They did a great job of generating trial, even though they very quickly had not only generic competitors, but using those generic products, a lot of branded competitors created lookalike products from brands like Aspercreme and even Dr. Scholl's had the same product under their brand names. But Voltaren did a great job of generating awareness, educating pharmacists at retail, generating trial, and it's a product that I use today. So I think they did a great job. That's one that I would point to.
So, Susan, so great to see you again. You work with a lot of brands who are making this transition from RX to OTC. I've heard that these can be really challenging and take a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about the process for people who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, let's start off, Alan, a little bit with philosophically how FDA looks at this. So, when a product is currently a prescription product, it means that the FDA has already agreed that the product is both safe and efficacious when there's a learned intermediary involved in the decision making process. That would be a doctor or sometimes a nurse, sometimes even a pharmacist who can assess the patient's condition, understand what other medications they might be on, and determine if this medication is right for this patient, and sometimes teach that patient how to use the drug. So the question in FDA's mind becomes, if you take this learned intermediary out of the equation, how will consumers behave? How does the risk and benefit change? Does the risk get greater and does the benefit outweigh that risk? And really today, the only tool we have to educate patients or to help patients use products properly is that drug facts label on the back of the package. And so it starts with creating a label on the back of the package that people literally understand. And we use sort of an open book test called the label comprehension study, where you might ask someone, okay, John has diabetes. Can John use this product? And they have to be able to read the label and discern whether or not the product is right for someone and how to use it, et cetera. And typically, we're only testing language that might be different from other OTC products. So if there's no new language, we can almost skip that step. The next step is called a self selection study, also a consumer behavior study, really, where consumers apply their own knowledge of their personal health history to that label that we've now demonstrated can be understood not only by regular folks, but folks who have low medical literacy as well. And so now we might be talking to John who has diabetes and asking John, is it okay for you to use this product? And so that person has to be able to apply their own personal health history to this product. And this is a place where some switches have failed or have had issues. When I think about Singulair, which is a product that was from Merck, and they tried to switch it for both asthma and allergy, but it has an increased risk of suicidality in teenagers. FDA made the sponsor test this label with teenagers, and of course, 40% of the immortal teenagers said, oh, I know what they're looking for. They just want to make sure I've gone through puberty. It's okay for me to use this product. So they failed. FDA sometimes will then ask sponsors to do an actual use study, and that might be a study under simulated OTC conditions. But it's really hard to simulate OTC conditions in a clinical study. We just recently saw this with Opil, which Perrigo is trying to switch. It's a progestin only oral contraceptive. And women were given the opportunity to use this oral contraceptive for up to 6 months. And they kept a daily diary of, did they actually remember to take the product? Did they take it at the same time every day? Did they have any side effects? So they had 6 times 28 pills that they could take, but some women in the study reported taking 500 pills. So clear they were being incented to make diary entries. And so then, how do you really reconcile the data with this simulated OTC condition? We're also starting to see other kinds of studies involved to help FDA assess that risk benefit argument, things like real world evidence, sometimes a human factor study, which demonstrates how people interact with perhaps a device. Narcan had to do that. But now FDA is starting to consider, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit later, whether or not more difficult switches where you can't simply rely on the label could in fact rely on technology to enhance consumer understanding of whether or not the product is appropriate for them.
Well, as a consultant, you've worked on over 50 RX to OTC switches. We all know firsts are very memorable and we learn a lot from our first. What was your first launch and what was that experience like for you and some of those learnings?
I actually started working on RX to OTC switches in the mid 90s. I was at SmithKline Beecham at the time, which is a predecessor to what is now one of the Haleon companies. And I was there when we switched Tagamet and Nicorette. And I was in portfolio management looking at what should we do as follow-ons to those? Because one of the secrets of success is you really need to have a pipeline of innovation. I'm going to go off on a tangent for a second. When we think about Advil, for example, Advil was switched in 1984, right? But the Advil that we see today, Advil more recently in 2020 switched, and I'm putting that in quotes because it was never really an RX product, Advil dual action, which is a combination of ibuprofen and acetaminophen. But over the years, they've switched additional indications, additional dosage forms. They've maintained that pipeline of innovation. And that's what I started to do in the mid 90s at SmithKline Beecham. As a consultant, yes, we've worked on over 50 ARCs to OTC switches. I have to tell you, some of them haven't seen the light of day yet, but some of my favorites are the ones that actually will never see the light of day. Either they're not commercially viable, and we could go off and talk about that, or there's no way from a safety perspective FDA would ever be
Mhm.
able to justify the risk benefit argument of some of these going over the counter.
Well, to your point, Susan, you learn a lot from your successes, but way more maybe from some of the failures. And those are sometimes the passion projects, and you get to go through them, and they are the stories you always remember.
Absolutely.
So, Susan, my wife and I watch a lot of streaming TV, and we're always getting ads for RX OTC, RX OTC switches. And it just seems like there's a ton of money out there for these kinds of products. Can you dimensionalize roughly what the marketing budget might look like for a tier one RX to OTC switch?
Yeah, I think the ads that you're getting on TV are probably for prescription products. And prescription products have a much larger profit margin than consumer healthcare products. And most of us Americans are fortunate enough that we have prescription coverage that covers the cost of those prescription medications. When we talk about some of the RX to OTC switches, we are talking about launch year budgets of over $100 million. Now, those can really pale in comparison to an RX drug. Voltaren was up there in terms of an A launch in trying to generate awareness that it was now available without a prescription. But I think one of the mindsets that folks need to adjust to is that for a prescription product, when a prescription product launches, it's profitable from day one. With a successful RX to OTC switch launch, we are often spending more in that year one marketing than we are getting back in sales. And it has to be an investment time. It's very hard. It's a very difficult business model for a lot of folks, particularly pharma folks, to accept. But if you think about a branded pharma product, that branded pharma product has a life that is as long as its patent life. And about 6 weeks after the patent expires, they've lost 90% of their sales. Whereas in a consumer product, which an RX to OTC switch is, right? It's a great way to launch a new to the world consumer healthcare product. And so with these consumer healthcare products, if we build the equity and are really smart about building awareness and building the equity behind these products, they can live into perpetuity. Patents no longer become an issue. We talked about Advil earlier, switched in 1984. Claritin switched in 2002, right? So these are brands that the patents have long since expired, but we keep offering solutions that address unmet consumer needs. We keep generating the equity and the brand awareness. And this is why these switches, when we first launch them, we really need to be willing to spend and spend heavily.
Let's talk a little bit about the role the shopper insights play with these sort of launches. I just went through this the other day to pick up medications. I was thinking about this is, they go through, do you understand? This is the dosage. These are the side effects. When you're looking at consumer insights, how do you go about determining what are going to be the barriers in these switches from the consumer side of things?
That's another great question. And I think it depends on if we're talking about something that's really first in class or is a follow on and maybe something that's a little bit better. But the success in a consumer healthcare practice, you have to address an unmet consumer need. You really need to understand what are those consumer pain points, right? And be able to communicate how you're addressing those. So if you're a follow on, like another non sedating antihistamine, right? How are you different? How are you better? Are you faster? Are you better for overnight, et cetera, et cetera? With some of these more first in class or novel RX to OTC switches, there needs to be a lot more research done around what is that path to purchase. How are you going to help consumers understand what the product is for and when they should use it? When a switch first happens, doctors and pharmacists still play a very important role in that decision making. The doctors have the opportunity to tell their patients this product is now available without a prescription. But the pharmacists also have to be able to answer questions for now no longer patients, but consumers. They need to know where it's stored on the shelf. And the price point needs to be one that the patient doesn't or the consumer doesn't want to go running back to the doctor for a different alternative.
For most shoppers, will these switches end up saving them money or does it end up being more expensive for them or does it really just depend?
I hate to say it really depends, but I think when we talk about the price to the consumer, there's the shelf price, right? What I used to pay in my copay versus now the $49.99 I need to pay. But when we think about how difficult it is for consumers to get an appointment with a doctor today, on one hand, the price on the shelf might be higher for the consumer. But when we think about the holistic cost for the insured consumer, the holistic cost might be it's actually less expensive for me to go buy the OTC product. I think one of the things that a lot of these switches have done really well is They understand the need to get people, you need to generate awareness and then you need to generate trial. And so when Voltaren launched, right, as a prescription product, there was a 100-gram tube. But when they switched, they got approval for a 50-gram tube that they were able to retail at $9.99. That's a great entry price point. So I use this product. If it gives me relief, I'm going to go back and buy a bigger size next time.
Can you talk a little bit more about the retail sell-in process and how, when you're going to market, it works with these products?
The retailers are really hoping for 2 years of collaboration before a switch is launched. Of course, one of the issues there is you don't always know what your timeline is going to be, but they are looking for co creation. They are looking for a big launch on day one where it's announced on their website, where you have maybe even reserved space on the shelf before the product launches with coming soon. Reserving this space on the shelf also helps with execution on day one. There might be speed packs that get shipped directly to the retail stores rather than to the retailer's distribution centers. You're trying to play that balance in collaborating with retailers to drive that traffic into their store, to figure out what else is going to be in the consumer's basket. They want to be the first, they want to have a launch on day one.
So, Susan, the companies who are doing this oftentimes have a great B2B muscle. They've been selling to other businesses for decades or more, but they don't always have a B2C background or traditional CPG experience in house. How do they build that capability?
Alan, that's a really interesting question. In any strategic endeavor, there are three models: build, buy, or borrow. When Sanofi wanted to switch Allegra, it bought Chatham. I don't think we're going to see a lot of that going on here. And so either you build a consumer health organization completely from scratch, which can be very expensive, or you borrow. You use capabilities like, a third party logistics company. So you might have been distributing to drug wholesalers, but now you've launched something OTC, and there are over 100 Walmart distribution centers, and each one of those is going to be placing a separate PO every single week. And you have to be able to supply them and supply them on time. And you don't want to be shipping partial truckloads to them. So you partner with a third party logistics provider that does this and can maybe also handle order to cash. Or maybe work with an OTC sales broker, and there's several great ones out there. There's Emerson Group and MPG and Advantage that help you get in front of the right people and the right buyer and have the experience for a successful launch. I think the one core capability that people do need to keep in house is probably marketing, but it is a different marketing mindset. Marketing to consumers is very different than marketing to doctors. And so you do need to hire the right people with the right experience to set really the strategy there, not only for marketing, but for the business going forward.
Hi, Jesse. What brings you to the airport?
Mike, I'm off to the headquarters to share an update on the big launch.
Oh, I've heard it's selling really well. Care to share your secret?
Well, just between us, it's all thanks to Bold Labs. Their exclusive digital test market research allows you to optimize your product, marketing, and pricing before the big launch.
That sounds fantastic. How can I learn more?
Just visit www.boldlabs.com. It's all right there.
This is the final call for Flight 723 to Chicago.
Looks like we'd better go. Thanks for the tip, Jesse.
See you soon, Mike. And remember, Bold Labs is ready to help your product soar.
So, in some instances, there's strong social viewpoints about the product. Looking at past switches like Plan B, and we have some upcoming launches, over the counter versions of Narcan and oral contraceptives. How do you approach that from a marketing standpoint and consumer reaction? Because you do know going into some of these, there is going to be very strong point of views on both sides of the fence.
There are going to be very different points of views on
Yes.
both of these, right? So Narcan, I think, a lot of people hold the point of view that, oh, yeah, that's for drug abusers, right?
Mhm.
And it really isn't. Um, there are millions of Americans who are at risk for opioid overdose. They're people who are taking their opioids exactly as prescribed. Part of it is understanding, what doing a lot of education around changing those preconceived notions. Education, I think public relations is going to be really important for them because this has a huge public health impact. This is the first OTC drug where you might be able to save someone's life. So, how do you get people to understand the impact that they could potentially have by having this drug on hand, which is very different from oral contraceptives, right? There are going to be those people who who believe that maybe it's going to promote promiscuity by having oral contraceptives available over the counter. So this is where at the beginning of a launch we are going to see for both of these a lot of education, a lot of public relations, and a real focus in both of these cases on the public health impact.
And you take something like the Narcan side of things. What's interesting is you said it's the education of where I take it as an EpiPen, right? You don't know when you're going to use it, who's going to be in your house, if they have allergies, so forth. We see all the time in the news. It's not just the drug users that are getting something with fentanyl. It is a big epidemic, and you don't know when you're going to come across it. So I see it not only being in households, but being in hotels or restaurants. It is almost explaining to the consumer there is a moral obligation if you come across this that you carry it, that you could save a life with it, which is
Yeah.
so impactful, right? And then the contraceptive, as you said, there is the education. A lot of it goes back to a lot of uninsured and being able to have access to contraceptions as well.
You're preaching to the choir, Darcy.
Yep. So, Susan, my perception on these launches is they're too big to fail. Like they've spent so much time and money to make them successful that it's just going to work out. But I'm sure that's not the case. Can you think of a big failure that maybe taught the industry something?
Yeah, unfortunately, there have been a lot of failures. Research that we did a couple years ago showed that since 2000, about 40% of RX to OTC switches have failed. I think an important one that I worked on was Oxytrol. Oxytrol is a patch for overactive bladder. I was at Shearing Plow when that switch process started. Shearing Plow was eventually acquired by Merck by the time the approval was gained. FDA initially was concerned that for overactive bladder, men might misdiagnose themselves and really have BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia, or prostate cancer. And so, first of all, FDA wanted to make sure that this product switched only for women. So the product was as pink as it could be. And the OTC product was actually called Oxytrol for women, but it's a patch for overactive bladder. And women, particularly postmenopausal women, suffer in this country from overactive bladder. They plan, if you watch the prescription television commercials, they plan their bathroom trips and they really, really do. When I think about this in hindsight, and I think other people might have a difference of opinion, you had this patch in this pink little package. If you put it next to the diapers in the drugstore, as a physical package, it's teeny, it gets lost. In a lot of retail stores, it was shelved with pregnancy tests and products for UTI, which is a different user group. And I didn't have really this much of an insight until we worked on another switch that is not moving forward. But there's a mock drugstore in northern New Jersey where you can do market research. And we took a package of this proposed switch and it was going to be a first in class switch. So where do you put it in the drugstore? Because going back to your question about working with retailers, you also want to be able to tell retailers that we believe that we're going to maximize the value if it goes here in the drugstore. So we'd done market research on this one drug and we had different hypotheses about where it could go in the drugstore. And what was really interesting to me was that depending on what we put it next to, gave off different connotations of efficacy. And so now when I go back and I look at Oxytrol, which either you put it next to diapers or in many cases it's next to pregnancy tests and things for UTI that really aren't drugs, and it's a patch dosage form to begin with, like what did consumers think about this if they had never heard about the drug? Do you really believe that this product that was once a prescription product is really going to relieve my overactive bladder, which is so serious and I need to map the bathrooms in the zoo?
What are some of the changes that you've seen with these launches over the years, and what has changed just going to market and the process of that and the consumer journey?
With any product, I used to say there's only two things you need to do to be successful. You need to get the product on the shelf, and you need to get the consumer to take the product off the shelf. If you can do those two things really well, you've got success. But let's think about how both of those have changed for any consumer healthcare product in the last few years, right? Getting the product on the shelf now is so much of a digital shelf journey. Consumers are pre-shopping that digital shelf. They're learning about the product online. They are buying it online. If it might be sensitive, I don't know. I mean, I'm really curious to see how much of Narcan sales are going to be online versus in store, right? Are people going to be embarrassed to buy this product in their local store where they might run into their neighbor? Would they rather just have it discreetly delivered to their home so nobody is making judgments about them? And then getting the product off the shelf. I mean, it used to be that you did television and print once upon a time. And so much more of the generating awareness and generating education is done online today versus once upon a time.
We talk all the time. Obviously, being in the digital space, Susan, is it's the shy buy, right? There's so many OTCs that you don't want to walk up to the counter, even Plan B, and say, "Okay, this was me last night," or whatever is happening. Or, like you said, the Narcan, the stigma that goes with some of the OTCs, having the e-commerce and that digital side of it has allowed for those shy purchases to become more accessible to consumers. And the other thing is direct to consumer sites. A lot of times in the OTC space, they really become more of a knowledge center or a learning center for consumers so that they can go understand the product, how to take the product. So there's a lot that can be done in that digital space, I think, to eliminate some of those shopper barriers.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Plan B, Darcy. And I know this wasn't on our agenda to discuss, but Plan B is a great example of how, when you switch a drug, you improve access and you normalize it. When Plan B was a prescription product, it had sales of $30 million as a prescription product. When it switched, the New York Times predicted that maybe sales would double 30 million when it switched. Today, Plan B as a brand is over $500 million in sales. It is the number one selling SKU in drugstores because it's a one pill SKU, right? It's not like they're offering large sizes of it. And obviously, there are a number of private label competitors, but that is a very powerful switch. And I think that the stigma has really decreased behind needing Plan B.
To your point, Susan, it also reframed how they were utilizing it, right? So the woman now can just keep it under her counter and her sink. And if, there's a shelf life there, and if she needs it, it's not the, oh my goodness, I have to run to the doctor, I have to go fill the prescription, I have to look everybody in the eye and them know personally what I've been doing. So I also think there is that it alleviates too. Now it can just, if it happens, it's there, they can go to it. It's a comfort she receives at the end of the day. As a mom of two who have had two kids, I am done having kids, but accidents can happen and, so forth. It's nice to normalize some of that. And I think a lot of these switches allow for that to happen.
So, Susan, I'm going to ask you the really tough question because it's so general, but I'm sure you're going to have a great answer anyway. What advice would you give a company considering an RX to OTC switch?
I think there's really two questions. Let's make it as simple as possible. Can you do it? So is it switchable? Can you make a good risk benefit argument that if you take this learned intermediary out of the equation, consumers can safely and efficaciously use it and it's going to improve public health? And then the other question is, should you do it? Is there going to be value at the end of the day? What do your cost of goods look like? Is it going to offer a better alternative for consumers versus something that's already out there? And does it make economic sense for you to do that? And if the answer to both of those questions is yes, then absolutely.
Susan, we'd love for you to catch us up on what you're currently working on, if you don't mind.
So our team is currently working on 5 first-in-class RX to OTC switches, again, because there's a lot of not the usual suspects out there who need our help. We love doing that. We're also working on some follow-on switches.
So, Susan, this is what you do. This is really your focus area. If someone's interested in getting a hold of you, how do they do it?
Would love to chat with anyone, Alan. Happy to spend time talking to people. This is my passion topic. They can find us online. Our website is sblconsultinggroup.com. They can find me on LinkedIn. My email is susan at sblconsultinggroup.com. And our office number is 908-654-1054.
Well, perfect. Susan, I want to say thank you for sharing these fascinating stories and your personal experience of switching RX medications to OTC. At the end of the day, it's stories like yours that remind us to keep innovating, stay inspired, and let us all continue to redefine the world of CPG innovation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Darcy.
You've been listening to CPG Launch Leaders, a show from Bold Strategies Incorporated. Don't miss the next thrilling launch story. Follow the podcast on your podcast player now. Please give us a rating, leave a comment, and share episodes with your friends. Until next time.